when Margaret Hayes is abandoned on a desolate farm with her 3 children after her husband's death, the village expects her to fail. But beneath the cracked soil and crumbling walls lies something the community tried to bury, a truth so powerful it will shatter their carefully constructed silence. What begins as a story of survival becomes a revelation that will force an entire town to confront what they've hidden for generations. If you're ready to witness a story that will stay with you long after it ends, hit that like button and subscribe. You won't want to miss what happens next. The farm stood like a broken promise at the edge of the valley, its walls bleached by decades of unforgiving sun, its windows dark as closed eyes. Margaret Hayes arrived there on a Tuesday afternoon in late September. Her 3 children huddled in the back of a rusted pickup truck that belonged to someone who wouldn't even look at her when he drove away. The dust from his departure hung in the air long after the engine's growl faded into the distance, and in that silence, that terrible, complete silence, she understood that this was not temporary. This was abandonment dressed as charity, cruelty wrapped in the language of community obligation. Her husband, Thomas, had been dead for 6 weeks, and in those 6 weeks, she had watched her entire life collapse like a house of cards touched by a child's careless hand. The children said nothing as they climbed down from the truck bed. Emma, the eldest at 12 years old, carried her younger brother Daniel on her hip, even though he was nearly too heavy for her thin arms. Little Sophie, barely 5, clutched a stuffed rabbit that had lost one eye somewhere during their eviction from the only home they had ever known. Margaret watched them move toward the farmhouse door with the slow, defeated shuffle of refugees, and something inside her chest, something she had been carefully holding together with willpower and desperate prayer, finally cracked. Not broke. Cracked. There is a difference. A crack suggests the possibility of either complete shattering or unexpected strength, and Margaret Hayes had not yet decided which direction her breaking would take her. The farmhouse door hung crooked on its hinges, groaning open with a sound like a wounded animal when she pushed it. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of abandonment, mildew and rot, and something else, something older and stranger that she couldn't name. Furniture remained, but it was the furniture of ghosts. A table with 3 legs, chairs with broken backs, a stove that looked like it hadn't been lit in a generation. Sunlight filtered through holes in the roof, creating columns of illuminated dust that looked almost holy, almost like the light she remembered from the church where she had married Thomas, where she had believed in promises that turned out to be as fragile as spider silk. The village council had told her this was an opportunity, a chance to prove herself capable, to show that she could provide for her children without the charity of others. But standing in that ruined kitchen, watching her children's faces struggle between tears and the terrible blankness of shock, she knew the truth. They had sent her here to fail. They had sent her here to disappear. That first night, they slept huddled together on the only bed that remained intact, an iron-framed thing in the upstairs bedroom that overlooked the fields. Through the broken window, Margaret could see the land stretching out in all directions, acres of untended earth, gone wild with weeds and stubborn grass, bordered by a line of trees so dark they looked like a wall between this world and some other, darker place. The moon was nearly full, and in its light, she thought she saw something moving out there in the fields, something that walked with strange, deliberate gait that was neither quite human nor quite animal. But exhaustion pulled her under before fear could fully form, and she dreamed of Thomas, not as he had been in death, gray and still in his coffin, but as he had been on their wedding day, young and laughing, telling her that he would always protect her, always keep her safe. When she woke before dawn, Emma was already awake beside her, staring at the ceiling with eyes that looked far older than 12 years should allow. "Mama," Emma whispered in the pre-dawn darkness, her voice carrying a question she seemed afraid to fully ask. Why did they really send us here? And Margaret had no answer that wouldn't sound like a lie. So she pulled her daughter closer and said nothing at all, listening to the house settle and creak around them like something alive, like something breathing, like something that had been waiting a very long time for someone to finally come home. The first 3 days were survival in its most primitive form. Margaret discovered a well behind the house that still held water, though it tasted of minerals and something faintly metallic that made her hesitate before letting the children drink. But thirst is a powerful thing, and soon they were all drinking from it, filling the cracked ceramic pitcher she found in the kitchen and rationing it carefully throughout the day. Food was more difficult. The village council had left them 2 sacks of flour, a jar of lard, and a bag of dried beans, enough to last perhaps 2 weeks if she was careful. Perhaps less if she wasn't. She made flatbread on the ancient stove, coaxing fire from the damp which she found stacked in the barn, teaching herself to cook the way her grandmother had described, but she had never needed to learn, back when life had been easier, back when Thomas had been alive and working and bringing home wages that kept them fed. Emma took on responsibilities without being asked, becoming a second mother to her younger siblings. She would wake with the sun and sweep the kitchen floor with a broom whose bristles were so worn they barely touched the ground, and she would heat water for washing and dress Sophie in the same faded dress she wore every day, because they had only been allowed to take 1 bag of clothing each when they left their old home, and children grow so quickly that nothing fit quite right anymore. Daniel, at 8 years old, tried to be useful in ways that broke Margaret's heart, carrying water from the well in a bucket too heavy for him, stacking wood by the stove until his small hands were covered in splinters, asking every evening if he had been good enough, if he had done enough. As though their situation was somehow a punishment, he could work his way out of through obedience and effort. On the 4th day, Margaret decided to explore the farm more thoroughly. She left the children with instructions to stay inside and lock the door, and she walked out into the fields with a strange mixture of dread and curiosity pulling her forward. The land was more extensive than she had realized from the house. At least 40 acres, maybe more, stretching from the house to the tree line in every direction. Most of it had gone completely wild. But as she walked, she began to notice patterns in the chaos. There were the remains of old furrows, evidence of planting done long ago. There were fruit trees scattered throughout, unpruned and overgrown but still bearing. Apples twisted and small but edible, pears hanging heavy on branches that scraped the ground. And there were structures she hadn't noticed before. A chicken coop that might be salvageable, a root cellar built into the side of a small hill, its door nearly hidden beneath years of accumulated soil and vegetation. The root cellar fascinated her. She approached it slowly, fighting the irrational feeling that she was trespassing, that she was opening something meant to stay closed. The door was heavy reinforced with iron bands, swollen with moisture and resistant to her pulling. But she was stronger than she looked. Grief and desperation had given her a kind of wiry strength she hadn't possessed before, and eventually the door groaned open, revealing stairs that descended into cool darkness. She had no lantern, but the daylight from the open door reached far enough for her to see that the cellar was large, its walls lined with empty shelves, its floor covered in a thick layer of dust that showed no footprint except, as she descended the stairs, her own. And there in the very back, she saw them, jars, dozens of jars, covered in dust but intact, their contents hidden behind layers of grime and age. Her hands shook as she carried the first jar up into the sunlight. She wiped it clean with her sleeve and held it up, squinting at what was inside. Preserved vegetables, green beans by the look of them, still whole and only slightly discolored. She opened it carefully, smelling at first the way her grandmother had taught her to check for spoilage, and finding it surprisingly sound. Whoever had put up these preserves had known what they were doing. Whoever had lived here before had prepared for survival, had stored away the summer's abundance against winter's inevitable hunger. She made 3 more trips to the cellar, carrying up jars of beans, tomatoes, corn, even some kind of preserved meat that might have been venison. That night, she fed her children the first real meal they had eaten since arriving, beans and tomatoes heated together with a bit of the lard and the last of her flour made into dumplings. She watched them eat with an intensity that bordered on ferocity, their small faces bent over their plates, and she felt something she hadn't felt in weeks. Hope. Small and fragile as a candle flame, but hope nonetheless. The next morning, she woke with a purpose that felt almost foreign after so many days of simply enduring. She would make this farm work. Not because the village council expected her to, not because she had any choice, but because her children needed her to. Because survival was a form of defiance, and she was discovering that she had more fight in her than anyone, including herself, had realized. She set Emma to sorting through preserves, checking each jar for spoilage, while she took Daniel out to the chicken coop to see if it could be made habitable. The structure was more solid than she expected, its walls intact though the roof needed patching. And there in the corner, half hidden beneath a pile of old straw, she found something that made her breath catch. 3 ceramic eggs, the kind used to encourage chickens to lay, which meant someone had intended for chickens to live here, which meant there might be a way to get chickens, to have eggs, to have protein beyond preserved meat that wouldn't last forever. That afternoon, she walked the village for the first time since being exiled to farm. It was a 3-mile walk along a dirt road that wound through fields belonging to other farmers, and she felt their eyes on her as she passed. Women pausing in their hanging of laundry, men stopping their work to watch her progress with expressions she couldn't quite read. No one called out. No one waved. She might have been a ghost for all the acknowledgement she received. The village itself was small and tight, its houses clustered around a central square that held a church, a general store, and the council hall where her fate had been decided. She went to the general store because she had no other choice, pushing open the door and stepping into the dim interior that smelled of flour and tobacco and coffee. The proprietor was a man named Silas Church, a thin figure with gray hair and eyes that never quite met anyone's gaze directly. He looked at her now with something that might have been sympathy or might have been discomfort. She couldn't tell which and didn't much care. "Mrs. Hayes," he said, his voice carefully neutral. "I heard you've been settled out at the old Whitmore place." The name meant nothing to her. "I need chickens," she said, ignoring the pleasantries he clearly didn't mean. 3 or 4 hens, and a rooster, if you have them. "I can't pay now, but I will, once the farm is producing." He looked at her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. "The Whitmore place hasn't produced anything in 20 years, he said quietly. "Not since." He stopped himself, and she saw something flicker in his eyes. Fear? Guilt? She couldn't be sure. "Not since what?" she asked, keeping her voice steady even though her heart had begun to beat faster. He turned away from her, busying himself with arranging cans on a shelf that didn't need arranging. "Nothing. Old stories. You don't need to worry about old stories." But the way he said it made it clear that she didn't need to worry, that there was something about the farm that people knew and she didn't, something that explained why it had been sitting empty for 2 decades, something that explained why they had sent her there. "I'll bring you the chickens tomorrow," he said, still not looking at her. "Consider a loan. You can pay me back when you're able." She wanted to press him, to demand he tell her what he'd been about to say, but she saw in the set of his shoulders that he wouldn't. So she thanked him and left, walking back to the farm with her mind spinning with questions that had no answers. The chickens arrived the next day, delivered by Silas's son, a boy of perhaps 16 who unloaded the crate from his wagon and was back on the road before Margaret could even properly thank him. 5 hens and a rooster, all healthy-looking and already accustomed to each other. She and Daniel installed them in the coop, spreading fresh straw and filling the water trough from the well, and she felt a strange pride in this small accomplishment. That night, she lay awake listening to the sound of the farm, the chickens settling in their roost, the wind moving to the broken places in the house, the strange creaking that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. And she found herself thinking about what Silas Church had almost said about the Whitmore place and the 20 years of emptiness, about old stories that she didn't need to worry about. Emma crept into her bed sometime after midnight, the way she had when she was much younger and frightened of storms. "Mama," she whispered, "I heard something outside. Something walking." Margaret held her daughter close and listened, and yes, there was the sound of footsteps, heavy and deliberate, circling the house. Not an animal. The gait was too measured, too purposeful. She rose and went to the window, peering out into the moonlit yard, and she saw it. A figure, tall and dark, standing at the edge of the tree line, watching the house, watching them. Her first instinct was fear, sharp and immediate, but then something else rose up in her, something harder and colder, anger. She had been abandoned here, cast out and forgotten, and now something or someone was trying to frighten her, to drive her away, to make her fail as they had expected her to fail. She wouldn't give them that satisfaction. She grabbed the iron poker from beside the stove and went to the door, flinging it open and stepping out onto the porch. "Who's there?" she called out, her voice carrying across the yard. "Show yourself." The figure didn't move, didn't speak, just stood there in the shadows at the tree line, impossibly still. She walked down the porch steps, gripping the poker so tightly her knuckles went white. "I said show yourself." But as she approached, the figure seemed to recede, to melt back into the darkness between the trees. She stopped at the edge of the yard, her heart pounding, every instinct screaming at her not to follow it into the woods. The moon was bright enough to see by, and she could make out the ground at the tree line, could see that there were no footprints in the soft earth, no sign that anyone had been standing there at all. She stood there for a long time, searching the shadows, but the figure didn't reappear. Eventually, the cold drove her back inside, where she found Emma and Daniel and Sophie all awake and huddled together in the kitchen, their eyes wide with fear. "It's all right," she told them, forcing her voice to sound calm and certain. "It was just an animal. A deer, probably. They come close to the house sometimes." She could see that they didn't quite believe her, but they wanted to, and that was enough. She got them back to bed and sat up the rest of the night in the kitchen, the poker across her lap, watching the windows for any sign of movement. But the night remained still, and as the sky began to lighten toward dawn, she felt exhaustion pulling at her like a tide. She allowed herself to close her eyes for just a moment, just to rest them, and when she opened them again, the sun was fully up and Emma was shaking her shoulder gently, saying, "Mama, come look, come see what happened." She followed her daughter outside, still groggy with interrupted sleep, and stopped at the edge of the porch. The yard had been transformed. The overgrown weeds had been cleared in neat rows, revealing the dark soil beneath. The broken fence had been repaired, its posts straightened and its rails secured. The path from the house to the barn had been swept clean, its stones reset into an even surface. And in the center of the yard, driven into ground like a stake, was a hand-forged iron tool, a mattock, old but well-maintained, its blade still sharp enough to catch the morning light. Margaret walked to it slowly, her mind refusing to process what she was seeing. This was hours of work. This was labor that should have been loud, that should have woken them all. But they had heard nothing after that first hour, when the figure had disappeared into the trees. She pulled the mattock from the ground and turned it over in her hands, looking for some clue, some indication of who had left it. The handle was smooth and dark with age, worn by hands long gone, and carved into the wood, so faint she almost missed it, were letters, a W. She traced them with her finger, wondering what they meant, who they belonged to. The work that had been done in the night was good work, skilled work, the kind that spoke of knowledge passed down through generations. Someone wanted her to succeed here. Someone was helping her. But why? And why in secret, under cover of darkness, like a phantom? She looked toward the tree line, half expecting to see the figure standing there again in the morning light. But there was nothing, just the trees, their leaves beginning to turn with the advance of autumn, and beyond them, whatever secrets the woods held. The weeks that followed established a rhythm that felt almost normal if she didn't think too hard about the strangeness underlying it all. The chickens began laying within days, providing eggs that Margaret traded in the village for other necessities: salt, sugar, needles for mending their worn clothing. The preserves in the root cellar stretched further than she had dared hope, supplemented by the wild apples and pears she and the children gathered from the untended orchard. She planted a late-season garden in one of the cleared spaces, unsure if anything would have time to mature before the frost, but willing to try, willing to do anything that might extend her survival through the winter that was coming fast on the heels of autumn. And every few nights, the mysterious help would appear. She would wake to find more fence repaired, or would split and stacked, or the barn roof patched where it had been leaking. Once, she woke to find the old plow that had been rusting in the barn cleaned and oiled, its blade sharpened, set carefully by the door as though waiting for her. She began leaving things out for whoever was helping them. A plate of food covered with a cloth, a jar of water, a note that said simply, "Thank you." In the morning, the food would be gone, but nothing else would be disturbed, and the note would remain unanswered. It was like living alongside a ghost, a benevolent presence that wanted to remain unseen, but also wanted them to survive. Emma became obsessed with discovering who their helper was. She would stay up late, hiding by the window with a blanket wrapped around her shoulders, watching the yard with the intensity of a young scholar studying an ancient text. But she never saw anything, never caught even a glimpse of whoever moved through their property in the deep hours of the night. "Maybe it's Papa," Sophie suggested one evening, her child's logic finding the explanation that made sense to her grief. "Maybe Papa came back to take care of us." Emma looked at Margaret with eyes that begged for permission to believe, but Margaret couldn't give it to her. Death was death, and Thomas was gone. Whatever was helping them was flesh and blood, not spirit. She was certain of that, even if she couldn't explain how. She returned to the village store more frequently, trading eggs and some preserved goods she felt comfortable parting with for other supplies. Silas Church was always cordial but distant, conducting their transactions with efficient politeness that discouraged conversation. But she noticed things. The way other customers would stop talking when she entered. The way people would watch her with expressions that mixed pity and something else. Something that looked almost like guilt. And she noticed that no one, not a single person, ever asked her how she was managing at the farm, as though they were all afraid of what she might tell them. One afternoon in mid-October, she encountered the village priest outside the church, an old man named Father Benedict, who had presided over Thomas's funeral with practiced sympathy. He stopped when he saw her, and for a moment, she thought he might actually speak to her honestly, might bridge the strange silence that surrounded her situation. "Mrs. Hayes," he said, his voice gentle, "I've been meaning to visit the farm, to see how you're settling in. But the roads have been so difficult with the rain and my duties here in the village." He trailed off, the excuse dying on his lips as he saw her expression. She waited, saying nothing, and in that silence, something in him seemed to crack. "You should know," he said quietly, glancing around to make sure no one else was listening, "that the Whitmore farm has a history, a difficult history. People in this village, they made decisions 20 years ago that they've had to live with. Decisions that perhaps weren't right, but that seemed necessary at the time." "What kind of decisions?" she asked, keeping her voice level even though her pulse had quickened. "What happened there?" He looked at her with eyes that held decades of moral compromise and pastoral responsibility, and she saw him weighing what to tell her, how much truth she deserved versus how much truth would only burden her further. "A family lived there," he said finally. "The Whitmores. Edgar and his wife Catherine and their daughter. They were good people, hard-working, kept to themselves mostly. But there was an accident. He stopped, correcting himself. Not an accident. An incident. The daughter fell ill, very ill, and Edgar became convinced that she could be healed through means that the village found troubling. There were accusations of witchcraft, of dark practices. The council decided the family needed to leave. Edgar refused. And then he looked away, unable to meet her eyes. And then the family disappeared. The farm has been empty ever since. People say it's cursed, that whatever darkness Edgar brought there still lingers. That's why no one would buy it, why it was given to you, the council thought. He stopped again, but she finished the sentence for him. The council thought it would be a fitting place for someone they wanted to forget about, she said flatly. Someone they wanted to fail. Father Benedict didn't deny it. I argued against it, he said softly. I told him it was cruel, but I'm just a priest. They don't listen to priests anymore. Not really. They listen to property rights and tax revenues and the politics of reputation. He reached out as though to touch her arm in sympathy, then thought better of it. I'm sorry, Mrs. Hayes. Truly, if there's anything I can do. But she was already walking away, her mind reeling with this new information. A family that disappeared. Accusations of darkness. A village that had driven them out or worse, and then locked away the memory behind 20 years of deliberate forgetting. She walked the 3 miles back to the farm in a daze, barely noticing the autumn leaves that carpeted the road in shades of rust and gold. When she reached the property line, she stopped and looked at the farmhouse with new eyes, tried to imagine the family that had lived there before, the Whitmores with their sick daughter and their desperation and their mysterious disappearance. The house looked different now, less like a ruin and more like a monument to something unfinished, some story that had never reached its proper ending. And she thought about the helper in the night, the invisible presence that seemed to want them to succeed here, and she wondered, was it possible? Could someone have survived whatever had happened 20 years ago? Could someone still be living out there in the woods, watching, helping, unable or unwilling to reveal themselves? That night, she did something she'd been too afraid to do before. She left a note with the food she set out. But this time the note said more than thank you. It said, I know about the Whitmores. If you were part of that family, you don't have a hide. We're not here to judge you. We're just trying to survive, same as you. She weighted the note down with a stone and went to bed, but she didn't sleep. She lay awake listening to the sound of the house, and sometime around midnight, she heard the back door creak open, heard soft footsteps in the kitchen below. Her heart hammered in her chest as she rose and crept to the stairs, Emma awake and following her despite Margaret's gestures to stay put. They descended the stairs together, mother and daughter, and in the kitchen, illuminated by the faint moonlight coming through the window, they saw her, a woman, or perhaps no longer quite a woman. It was hard to tell. She was thin to the point of emaciation, her clothes little more than rags held together by patches and hope, her hair long and matted and streaked with gray. But her eyes were clear, startlingly so, and they fixed on Margaret with an intensity that was both frightening and somehow pleading. She held the note in her hands, her lips moving silently as though reading it over and over, as though the words were a spell she was trying to comprehend. Margaret found her voice somehow, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. Who are you? The woman's mouth opened, but at first no sound came out, as though she had forgotten how to speak or had gone so long without speaking that her voice had atrophied. Then, finally, a single word rough and used. Grace. The name hung in the air between them. Grace Whitmore. Margaret said, understanding flooding through her. You're the daughter. You're the one who was sick. Grace nodded slowly, her eyes never leaving Margaret's face. They said you disappeared, that your whole family disappeared. Grace's expression flickered with something that might have been pain, or might have been anger, or might have been both. Didn't disappear, she said, her voice gaining slightly more strength. They made us disappear. My father wouldn't leave. They came at night. Men from the village. Men who called themselves righteous. Emma gripped Margaret's hand tightly, and Margaret squeezed back, giving her daughter the reassurance she needed, even though Margaret herself felt like she was standing on ground that might give way at any moment. "What happened?" she asked, though part of her didn't want to know, didn't want to hear whatever terrible truth Grace was about to speak. "They burned the barn," Grace said, her voice flat now, emotionless, as though the story had been told so many times in her own mind that it had worn smooth like river stones. "My father and mother were inside, trying to save the animals. They barred the doors from the outside. I watched from the woods where my mother had told me to hide if anyone ever came. I watched it burn. I watched until there was nothing left but ash and silence. The horror of it settled over Margaret like a suffocating blanket. You've been living in the woods all this time? For 20 years. Grace nodded. "Couldn't leave. This was my home. Only home I ever knew. And if I left, who would remember them? Who would know what really happened?" She looked down at the note in her hands again. "You're the first people who've lived here since. The council rents it sometimes, tries to get someone to take it, but they never stay. They feel the wrongness of it, the guilt. But you," she looked up at Margaret again, "you don't feel it. You're just trying to survive. I can help with that. Been helping." Margaret's mind raced, trying to process all of this, try to reconcile the woman standing before her with a mysterious presence that had been aiding them in the dark. "Why didn't you reveal yourself sooner? Why all the secrecy?" Grace's laugh was short and bitter. "Would you have believed me? Would you have welcomed me if I'd knocked on your door that first day, looking like this, telling you I'd been living wild in the woods for 20 years? Or would you have thought me mad, dangerous? Would you have run back to the village and told them there was still a Whitmore here, and let them come to finish what they started?" She had a point. Margaret couldn't deny it. But standing here now, looking at this woman who had lost everything and had survived through sheer stubborn refusal to let her family's memory be erased, Margaret felt something shift inside her. "Stay," she said suddenly, the word surprising her even as she spoke it. "Not out in the woods. Here, with us. We have room. God knows we could use the help, and you deserve—" She struggled to find the right words. "You deserve to live in your own home. This is your home. It was stolen from you, but you never left it. Stay." Grace stared at her as though Margaret had spoken in a foreign language, as though the concept of staying, of being welcomed, was so alien she couldn't quite grasp it. "You don't know me," Grace said carefully. "Don't know what living wild does to a person, what anger and grief and 20 years of solitude can make of someone." Margaret stepped forward, closing the distance between them. "I know you saved my children from starvation. I know you've been doing the work of 3 people to help us survive. I know you could have let us fail. You probably wanted to let us fail, to drive us away, so the village would have to face this place empty again. But you didn't. That tells me everything I need to know." Grace Whitmore moved into the farmhouse on a morning when frost lay thick on the ground and the sun rose pale and distant. She brought with her almost nothing. A few tools she had salvaged over the years, a leather journal filled with drawings and notes that Margaret didn't ask to see, and a small wooden box that she kept locked and never opened in anyone's presence. She took the smallest bedroom, the one with the window overlooking the orchard where her mother had once kept bees, and for the first few days, she moved to the house like someone relearning how to exist among people, how to speak in more than single words, how to trust that this wasn't temporary, wasn't a dream she would wake from to find herself alone again. The children adapted to her presence with the strange resilience of youth. Sophie was fascinated by Grace, following her around and asking endless questions about the woods, about animals, about how to do all the things Grace had learned to do alone. Grace answered with a patience that surprised Margaret, showing Sophie how to identify edible plants, how to read animal tracks, how to move through the forest without making a sound. Daniel was more cautious, watching Grace with a careful assessment of a child who has learned that the world can be dangerous, but he warmed to her when she taught him to repair tools, to sharpen blades properly, to work with his hands in ways that made him feel useful and capable. Emma, at 12, was old enough to understand more what Grace represented, and she watched the older woman with a mixture of admiration and sadness, seeing in her perhaps a vision of what survival could look like when everything else had been stripped away. Margaret found herself in long conversations with Grace in the evenings, after the children were asleep and the house had settled into its nightly creaking. Grace spoke of her parents, of the farm as it had been before everything went wrong, of the daughter who had been loved and protected and taught that knowledge was power, that understanding the natural world was not witchcraft but wisdom. "My mother was a healer," Grace explained one night, her hands wrapped around a cup of the chamomile tea she had made from plants she had gathered in the woods. People came to her from all over the valley when they were sick, when doctors couldn't help them or couldn't be afforded. She knew plants, knew how to make medicines, tinctures, poultices. She saved lives. She paused, staring into her tea as though reading leaves. Then I got sick, really sick, fever that wouldn't break, pain in my joints, weakness that meant I couldn't even stand. The doctors bled me until I was gray as ash, gave me mercury that made my teeth fall out, told my parents I was going to die and there was nothing to be done. "But your mother saved you," Margaret said quietly. Grace nodded. She did, with plants from the woods, with knowledge her mother had taught her and her mother before that, going back generations. Old knowledge. She brought me back from the edge. It took months, but I lived, and people saw it. Saw a child who had been dying suddenly recover, and instead of gratitude, they were afraid. They said it wasn't natural. Said there must have been dark bargaining involved. The priest, not Father Benedict, the one before him, started preaching about the dangers of folk magic, about how true Christians sought healing through prayer, not through the devil's weeds. Her voice had gone hard, and Margaret could hear the anger that 20 years had not diminished. My father tried to defend her, tried to explain, but people don't want explanations when they've already decided what they believe. The council told us to leave, said we weren't welcome anymore. My father refused. Said this land was ours, paid for with our labor and our sweat, and no council could take it from us. And so they came at night, Margaret finished, remembering what Grace had told her that first night, and they burned your parents alive. Grace set down her teacup with a hand that trembled slightly. Yes, and they told the valley it was an accident. Said Edgar Whitmore had been careless with a lantern in the barn. Said the family had left in grief afterward, moved away to start over somewhere else. 20 years of that lie. 20 years of everyone knowing the truth and saying nothing. She looked at Margaret with eyes that held a question. Why are you here? What did you do to make them want to get rid of you? Margaret laughed, but there was no humor in it, nothing dramatic. I was just inconvenient. Thomas died, and I had no money, no family to take us in, 3 children to feed. I represented an obligation the village didn't want to shoulder. So they sent us here, to the cursed farm that no one else would take, probably hoping we'd fail and they could wash their hands of us with a clear conscience, saying they'd given us a chance and we just weren't capable. She met Grace's gaze. But I'm not going to fail. Neither are you. We're going to make this farm thrive. We're going to force them to see us, to acknowledge us, to face what they did to you and what they try to do to us. Over the following weeks, something began to shift in the dynamic of the farm and, by extension, in its relationship with the village. Grace's knowledge of the land, combined with Margaret's determination and organizational skills, transformed their survival into something approaching prosperity. They harvested the late vegetables from Margaret's garden, squash and pumpkins and the last of beans, and stored them properly in the root cellar. They gathered walnuts and hickory nuts from the trees at the edge of the property, processing them into oils and flours that stretched their provisions. Grace showed them which mushrooms in the woods were safe to eat and which would kill, which bark could be brewed into medicine for coughs, and which roots could be dried and ground into spices that made even the plainest food palatable. Winter came early that year, arriving in November with a snowstorm that blanketed the valley in white silence. But the farm was ready. The root cellar was full of preserved food, carefully organized and inventoried. The barn had been repaired and insulated. The chickens safe and warm in their coop with plenty of feed stored for the months ahead. Firewood was stacked high against the side of the house, split and dried and ready to burn. Inside, the farmhouse had been transformed from a ruin into something approaching a home, the holes in the roof patched, the broken windows covered with oiled paper that let in light while keeping out the cold, the stove cleaned and functional and radiating warmth throughout the downstairs rooms. The children thrived in ways Margaret had not dared to hope for during those terrible first days. Sophie, under Grace's patient teaching, had become a tiny expert in natural history, able to identify birds by their calls and plants by their leaves, even in winter dormancy. Daniel had grown stronger, more confident, his skills with tools and repair work giving him a sense of competence and pride that had been missing when he felt like a burden to be carried. And Emma had discovered a gift for drawing, filling the margins of any paper she could find with sketches of the farm, the animals, the woods, Grace at work in the kitchen, Margaret standing in the doorway looking out at the land. She had an eye for detail that caught the essence of things, not just their surface appearance, and Grace had given her the old journal she kept during her years alone, saying, "Fill this with new memories, better ones than what I put in there." The village's relationship with the farm began to shift in subtle ways. At first, it was just Silas Church who acknowledged a change, conducting his trades with Margaret with new respect that bordered on deference. But gradually, others began to soften as well. Women who had previously turned away when Margaret approached now nodded in greeting. Men stopped their work to watch as she passed, but no longer with hostile judgment, instead with something approaching curiosity, perhaps even admiration, because word had spread about what was happening at the old Whitmore place, about the widow and her children, who were not just surviving, but thriving, about the ghosts who had turned out to be flesh and blood, who had endured 20 years of solitary wilderness existence and emerged still sane, still skilled, still human. In December, something unprecedented happened. Father Benedict appeared at the farm on a crisp morning when frost decorated every surface like divine calligraphy. He came on foot, walking the 3 miles from the village, and when Margaret opened the door at his knock, she saw in his face a complex mixture of emotions: shame, hope, determination. "Mrs. Hayes," he said, removing his hat, "I wonder if I might speak with you and Miss Whitmore, if she's willing." Grace had heard the knock and had appeared in the kitchen doorway, her posture tense, ready to flee if necessary. But Margaret gestured for her to stay, to listen. "Come in, Father," Margaret said, stepping aside. "We have tea." They sat at the kitchen table that Grace and Margaret had repaired together, hands wrapped around warm cups, and Father Benedict spoke words that Margaret suspected had been weighing on him for 2 decades. "I was young when it happened," he began. "Not yet ordained, just an assistant to Father Michaels, the priest before me. I knew the Whitmores. I knew Catherine was a good woman, a godly woman despite what others said about her healing work. I knew Edgar was an honest man, that Grace was an innocent child. And when the council came to Father Michaels asking him to denounce them from the pulpit, asking him to lend the church's authority to their campaign of persecution, I begged him not to. I told him it was wrong, that it went against everything Christ taught about mercy and compassion. He looked down at his tea, his old hand shaking slightly. He told me I was naive, that the church's position in the community depended on being aligned with the powerful, that we couldn't afford to stand against the council on behalf of a woman who practiced folk medicine, no matter how innocent her intentions. Grace's voice was cold when she spoke. So you stood by and let them burn my parents alive. Father Benedict flinched as though she had struck him. I didn't know they were going to do that. I swear to you, I didn't know. I thought they would just drive you out, make you leave. When I heard what had really happened, his voice broke. I tried to make Father Michaels report it to the authorities outside the village. He refused, said it would destroy the community, that we had to protect the village's reputation. So I kept silent. God forgive me, I kept silent. He looked up at Grace, and Margaret saw tears in his eyes. I've carried that silence like a stone around my neck for 20 years. Every Mass I've said, every sermon I've preached, every confession I've heard, I've known I was a hypocrite, that I failed the most basic test of faith, to stand with the innocent against the powerful. Why are you telling us this now? Margaret asked, not unkindly but needing to understand. Why not last month or last year or 10 years ago? Father Benedict set down his teacup and pulled something from his coat pocket, a leather-bound book, small enough to fit in his palm. This was Catherine Whitmore's, he said, holding out to Grace. Her journal of healing recipes and practices. She gave it to me for safekeeping months before everything happened, said she had a feeling trouble was coming and wanted to make sure her knowledge wasn't lost. I've kept it hidden all these years, too afraid to give it to anyone, too ashamed to destroy it. He placed it on the table between them. It belongs to you, Grace. It's your inheritance, your mother's legacy. Grace reached out slowly, her hand trembling as she touched the journal's cover. She opened it carefully, and Margaret saw her eyes moving over the pages, dense handwriting in faded ink, sketches of plants, detailed instructions for preparation of medicines. Tears began to fall silently down Grace's face, and Margaret reached over to take her hand, offering the only comfort she could. There's more, Father Benedict said quietly. The council has called a meeting. They want to discuss the situation at the farm. They're uncomfortable with how successful you've been, uncomfortable with the truth about the Whitmores becoming known. Some of them want to find a way to remove you, to take back the land, to restore the silence that's been broken. He looked at Margaret directly. I wanted to warn you, and I wanted to ask, when you go before them, would you allow me to stand with you? To finally speak the truth, I should have spoken 20 years ago. Margaret looked at Grace, waiting for her response, knowing this wasn't her decision alone. Grace closed her mother's journal carefully, holding it against her chest like a shield or a talisman. Yes, she said, her voice steady despite the tears still wet on her face. Yes, it's time for the truth. All of it. No more silence. No more pretending it didn't happen. She looked at Father Benedict. But I don't forgive you. Not yet. Maybe not ever. You don't get absolution just because you finally found the courage to do what you should have done decades ago. He nodded, accepting this. I don't expect forgiveness, he said quietly. I just want to do what's right. Finally, before I die and have to face God's judgment knowing I failed in this. The council meeting was set for 3 days hence, on the Saturday before Christmas. Margaret spent those days preparing, not just mentally, but practically. She gathered evidence of everything they had accomplished, jars of preserved food, examples of their soap and candles, the account book where she had carefully tracked every trade and transaction, proving they owed nothing and had built their success through their own labor. She asked Grace to prepare a written account of what had happened 20 years ago, every detail she could remember about the night her parents died, and she coached the children on what to say if asked, making sure they understood this was important, that adults sometimes needed to hear truth from children's voices to really believe it. On the day of the meeting, they dressed in their best clothes, which still weren't much, but were clean and mended and worn with dignity. They walked to the village together, all 5 of them plus Father Benedict, who had arrived at dawn to escort them. The council hall was fuller than Margaret had expected. Not just the council members, but what seemed like half the village, people cramming into benches and standing along the walls. Everyone wanted to witness whatever was about to happen. She felt their eyes on her as she walked in front of the room, felt their curiosity and judgment, and, in some faces, sympathy. The council chairman was a man named Ezekiel Moore, a prosperous farmer in his 60s who owned more land than anyone else in the valley. He called the meeting to order with a gavel that seemed unnecessarily loud in the packed room, and then he looked at Margaret with an expression that was hard to read. "Mrs. Hayes," he said formally, "you were granted residence at the former Whitmore property on the condition that you could make it productive and support your family without becoming a burden to the village. Some members of this council feel that inquiry should be made into exactly how you've managed to accomplish this, given that the property had been deemed uninhabitable for 2 decades. The implication was clear. They suspected something improper, perhaps something illegal. Margaret stood, her hands clasped in front of her to stop them from shaking, and she spoke clearly enough for everyone in the room to hear. "I accomplished it through hard work, good fortune, and the help of someone who had every right to be there. Grace Whitmore, daughter of Edgar and Catherine Whitmore, who has been living on that land for 20 years because it's her home and always was. She taught me and my children how to survive, how to use the resources the land provides, how to honor the knowledge her parents possessed. Everything we've built honestly and with our own hands." She paused, letting this sink in. "And I think it's time this council addressed the real question here, which isn't how I survived, but why Grace Whitmore had survived alone for 2 decades in the first place." The room erupted in whispers and mutters, and Ezekiel Moore banged his gavel for silence. "That's not the matter under discussion," he said sharply. "The past is past." But Father Benedict stood then, and when he stood, the room fell silent. "No, Ezekiel," the priest said, his voice carrying the authority of his office. "The past is not past when it's been hidden, when it's been lied about, when it continues to shape what we do and who we pretend to be. I was there 20 years ago. I know what happened, and I'm tired of carrying the weight of that silence. What happened next will be spoken about in the village for generations, becoming the story that divided time into before and after, the moment when carefully constructed fictions crumbled and truth, ugly and undeniable, finally had its day." Father Benedict began to speak, and as he spoke, his voice grew stronger, as though each word released was a weight lifted from his soul. He told them about the accusations against Catherine Whitmore, about the council's decision to drive the family away, about Edgar's refusal to abandon his land. And then he told them what many in the room already knew but had never acknowledged aloud, about the night 20 men from the village had ridden to the Whitmore farm, about the barn that had been locked from the outside with Edgar and Catherine inside, about the fire that had been set deliberately, about the murder that had been disguised as accident. As he spoke, Margaret watched the faces in the room. Some showed genuine shock. Younger people who had never known the truth, who had grown up with a sanitized version of events. But others, the older ones, the ones who had been adults 20 years ago, showed something different. Shame, fear, guilt, and in a few faces, defiance. The stubborn refusal to admit wrongdoing even when confronted with undeniable truth. Ezekiel Moore's face had gone red. His jaw clenched so tight Margaret could see the muscles jumping. "That's enough," he said, banging his gavel. "You go too far, Father. These are serious accusations you're making against respected members of this community." "It's not an accusation when it's the truth," Grace said, standing. Her voice was quiet, but it cut through the noise like a blade. "I was there. I watched from the woods where my mother had told me to hide. I saw their faces in the firelight. I heard my parents screaming. She pulled a folded paper from her pocket, the account Margaret had asked her to write, and began to read names. 20 names. Men who had ridden that night. And as she read each name, she looked directly at that man if he was in the room, or at his son if he had died in the intervening years. Samuel Fletcher, Thomas Crane, Ezekiel Moore. She paused on that last name, staring at the council chairman. You were there. You carried the torch that lit the hay. I saw you. I remember your face. The room exploded into chaos. People shouting, some in denial, some in shock, some, surprisingly, in agreement, saying it always suspected, always known something terrible had happened. Ezekiel Moore stood, his face now white with fury or perhaps fear. This is slander, lies from a mad woman who's been living wild for 20 years. She has no proof. I have proof, Grace said calmly, and she reached into her other pocket and pulled out something small and metallic, a button, ornate brass with a distinctive engraving. This fell from your coat that night. I found it in the ashes the next morning. I kept it. I've kept everything. She laid the button on the table in front of the council, and Margaret saw Ezekiel Moore's eyes go to it, saw recognition and horror cross his face, because it was his button, or more accurately, it was his father's button from the coat that Ezekiel had inherited, the coat he still wore to formal occasions, the coat whose left cuff was missing one button. Around the room, people were putting the pieces together, seeing the truth assemble before them like a puzzle that had been deliberately scrambled for 20 years. And they were having to decide, each of them, what they would do with that truth now that it could no longer be denied. Margaret felt the moment shift, felt power transfer from those who had held it to those who had been denied it. She stepped forward, her voice clear and strong. The question before this council is not whether I can support my family on that land. I've proven I can. The question is whether this village has the courage to face what it did, to make amends for it, and to allow Grace Whitmore to finally reclaim what was stolen from her, her family's name, her family's reputation, and her rightful inheritance of the property that belonged to the Whitmores and should still belong to them. She turned to address the room, rather than just the council. Grace doesn't want revenge. She wants justice. She wants recognition that her parents were good people who were murdered for no crime other than being different, being knowledgeable in ways that frighten small minds. And she wants to live on her family's land without fear, without hiding, without pretending to be something she's not. The silence that followed was profound. Then, from the back of the room, someone began to clap, slowly at first, then joined by others, until perhaps a third of the people in the room were applauding. Not the old men on the council, not the ones who had been complicit in the crime or in its cover-up, but their children, their grandchildren, the younger generation who were tired of living with inherited guilt and inherited lies. They stood and they clapped, and Margaret saw tears on some of their faces. Tears of relief, perhaps, that the secret that had poisoned their community for 20 years was finally being lanced like an infected wound. Ezekiel Moore sat down heavily, his face in his hands, and Margaret saw his shoulders shake. She didn't know if he was crying from remorse or simply from the shock of being exposed after so many years of thinking he had gotten away with murder. Either way, his power in this room had evaporated like morning mist. When he finally looked up, his voice was hoarse. "What do you want?" he asked, directing the question at Grace. "What would satisfy you?" Grace looked at him for a long moment, and Margaret saw her considering, weighing justice against vengeance, truth against peace. "I want the farm deeded to me legally," she said finally. "I want a stone monument erected where the barn burned, with my parents' real names on it and the truth of how they died. I want this council to issue a formal apology and acknowledgement of wrongdoing. And I want the church to hold a proper memorial service for Edgar and Catherine Whitmore, giving them the Christian burial and remembrance they were denied. And what about those of us who, Ezekiel Moore couldn't finish the sentence, couldn't say, who murdered them out loud? Grace's expression was hard. You'll have to live with what you did. That's punishment enough. I don't want you in jail. I don't want you hanged. I just want you to stop lying about it, to yourselves and to everyone else. She turned to the room. All of you who knew and said nothing, who pretended not to know, who taught your children the sanitized version of events, you're complicit too. But this is a chance to stop being complicit, to choose truth over convenience, to be better than you've been. The memorial service for Edgar and Catherine Whitmore was held on Christmas Eve in the church they had once attended before the village had turned against them. Father Benedict presided with a gravity and sincerity that gave weight to every word, every prayer. The church was full, not just with those who had supported Grace and Margaret, but with many who had remained silent during the council meeting, who had gone home and wrestled with their consciences and decided that attending was the least they could do. Grace stood in the front pew beside Margaret and the children, her hand gripping her mother's journal, and when Father Benedict invited her to speak, she walked to the pulpit with steady steps. She spoke of her parents not as victims, but as people, funny, flawed, loving, complicated human beings who had worked hard and loved deeply and deserved to be remembered for more than how they died. She talked about her mother's healing work, about the dozens of people in the valley who owed their lives or their health to Catherine's knowledge and care. She talked about her father's integrity, his refusal to be moved by threats or intimidation because he believed his right to live peacefully on his own land. And she talked about what they had taught her, to be curious, to be brave, to trust in knowledge and reason and the evidence of her own eyes rather than in fear and superstition and mob judgment. When she finished, there was not a dry eye in the church, and Margaret felt pride swell in her chest for this woman who had survived the unsurvivable and emerged with her humanity not just intact but burnished bright by suffering. The service concluded with the lighting of candles, each person in the congregation lighting one from their neighbor's flame until a whole church glowed with soft light, and Father Benedict said a blessing over Grace and over the farm and over the community itself, asking for healing and forgiveness and the courage to build something better from the wreckage of the past. The spring that followed brought changes to the valley that no one could have predicted. The farm, now legally deeded to Grace Whitmore, with Margaret and her children listed as co-residents and co-managers, became a center of learning rather than a place of isolation. Grace began teaching others, especially young women, the healing knowledge her mother had possessed, refusing to let that wisdom die with Catherine. She framed it not as magic or witchcraft, but as science passed down through generations, as careful observation of nature's patterns and properties. And people came. Slowly at first, then in increasing numbers, drawn by curiosity and by the dawning realization that knowledge was not dangerous, that learning from those different from yourself was not corruption, but enrichment. Margaret's children grew strong and confident on that land. Sophie became Grace's most dedicated student, absorbing plant lore and healing practices with the intensity of a scholar finding her calling. Daniel discovered a gift for engineering and mechanics, his early lessons with tools blossoming into an intuitive understanding of how things worked and how to fix them when they broke. And Emma continued to draw, filling journal after journal with images that captured not just surfaces but souls, her artistic eye-seeing and recording truth in ways that words sometimes couldn't manage. They would all leave eventually, the way children do, to seek their fortunes and build their own lives. But the farm would always be home, always the place they returned to, the place where they had learned that survival was possible even when everything seemed lost, that community could be rebuilt even after betrayal, that truth was worth fighting for even when lies were more comfortable. As for Grace herself, she found something in those years that she had thought lost forever: peace. Not the peace of forgetting, but the peace that comes from being witnessed, from having your story told and believed, from knowing that your parents are remembered not as cautionary tales, but as real people who mattered. She would never fully forgive the village for what it had done, but she learned to coexist with it, to take what it offered now and to give back in measure. The monument to Edgar and Catherine Whitmore stood in the meadow where the barn had burned, a simple stone marker that told the truth in plain language, and Grace tended it carefully, planting wildflowers around it each spring, so that her parents' resting place was always beautiful, always alive with color and growth. Margaret would sometimes wake in the early morning and stand on the porch, watching the sun rise over the fields they had reclaimed from wildness, and she would think about the journey that had brought her here, from desperate widow to prosperous farmer, from victim to victor, from someone the village wanted to forget to someone it couldn't ignore. She had learned that strength came not from never falling, but from rising after you fell. That family could be chosen as well as given. That the most powerful act of defiance was simply refusing to disappear when the world wanted you erased. And standing there in the growing light, with Grace emerging from the house to stand beside her and the children still sleeping peacefully upstairs, she felt something she had not felt since Thomas died. She felt whole. She felt home. She felt like herself again, but deeper, stronger, refined by fire into something that could not be easily broken. The farm would thrive for generations, passing eventually to Sophie's daughter and then to her granddaughter, each inheriting not just land but legacy, the story of women who refused to be defeated, who turned abandonment into opportunity, who transformed a place of tragedy into a place of healing. And sometimes, on quiet nights when the moon was full and the wind moved through the old trees, people walking the road past the farm would swear they could see figures moving the fields, not frightening but gentle, like guardians or witnesses, like the spirits of Edgar and Catherine Whitmore finally at rest, knowing their daughter had survived, knowing their farm had become what they always dreamed it could be, knowing that truth had finally won out over the lies that had tried to bury it. Whether these sightings were real or imagined didn't matter. What mattered was that the farm was no longer a place people avoided, no longer a monument of fear and silence, but instead a testament to resilience and the stubborn, beautiful insistence that some things, truth, dignity, love, could survive even the worst that humanity had to offer. If this story moved you, if it made you think about what we owe to truth and to each other, hit that like button and subscribe. Stories like this matter. Your support helps us tell them.